Hello and welcome to the U.S. Center. This event is Small Islands, Big Challenges, Evolving the International Climate Finance Architecture to Meet the Climate Finance Priorities of Small Island Developing States. And now I'd like to welcome to the stage Alexia Latortu, Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Give her a warm welcome.
Hello, everybody. Good to see you. I recently received an electronic postcard from a colleague, and it read as follows. Majuro is essentially a silver of land that wraps around a lagoon. Stand in the middle of the main and only road. You see water on both the left and right. King tides can very occasionally wash over parts of the island. Almost all houses have seawalls to protect against coastal flooding, and a water tank that stores clean drinking water to counter growing droughts. For those of you who don't know, Majuro is the capital of the Marshall Islands. And for the Marshall Islands, climate change is an existential, not threat, reality today already. And indeed, it's not just the Marshall Islands, it's many small island development states. And so welcome to this panel that's focusing on small islands with big challenges and looking to explore what some of the solutions might be. For small island development states, climate action is not an option. It is a matter of survival. And yet, we know that it can be tedious, difficult, to access even the existing finance that is available. Why is that? We will delve into this question with a fabulous panel. And so I'm very glad to have with us, we're very honored at the U.S. Center to have the Prime Minister of Barbados with us, Mia Mottley. We're thrilled to also have with us James Scriven, who's the CEO of IDB Invest. And also very honored to have with us Hong Patterson, who's the CFO and COO of the Green Climate Fund. Let's just jump right into the conversation. Prime Minister, the very first time I saw you, it was a video clip my father sent of you talking at the UN General Assembly in 2019 about the urgency of climate action for small island developing states. Can you set the scene for us and tell us what are the needs, what's working, what's not working for you today?
You got all day?
I'm afraid not, and there's a nice little red clock here.
I'm only joking. Look, the truth is that we've seen some progress made recently, and perhaps the biggest benefit has and will come from the climate resilience debt clauses, the debt pause clauses, and to simplify it, that's going to release, for example, for us, the equivalent of almost 20% of GDP within a 2-year period if we have a climatic event of significant proportions. We've also seen, before then, James, the IDB had a contingent payment that will be due to countries that suffer disasters, which is either 80 million US or 3% of GDP, whichever of the two is the lesser, which perhaps we'd like a little review on. And thirdly, we've seen that the World Bank is introducing a similar clause, so that there is a greater sensitivity as to the needs of countries post-disaster. But post-disaster is not where the game is at. We want to ensure that we can avert disasters and reduce losses. And to that extent, the work that we've been calling for is a review of how we fund adaptation. And Alexia, you've been at the center of much of those discussions. We believe that we've seen the needle move with the World Bank and with the multilateral development banks, but we need to go further, because if not, we're not going to have enough for everybody. And it's the same thing with the loss and damage fund post-disaster. We're at 720 million today. It's good, but it's not going to be enough. Lord Stern and Rhea Songway estimate that we need about 300 billion a year. So we really need to pause and scale up. And why? What is the tipping point for us that our countries can become uninsurable and uninvestable? And we've seen what has happened in California, with insurance companies retreating. We're seeing what is happening in Florida. We're also facing similar experiences in the region with increased premiums. And there comes a point at which the government has to stand in the breach, as is happening in Florida, with respect to the losses that their citizens and their companies, small businesses are incurring. But then there's a point beyond which governments themselves can't do it alone either, because of the impact on its macroeconomic stability. And to that extent, therefore, we really do believe that unless we can reform the global financial architecture, unless we can, one, start to be able to recognize that not every dollar of debt is the same, and therefore there is a need perhaps for us to focus in on 30 and 40-year lending, not just for climate adaptation, but for education and health and the other development needs that are critical to the SDGs getting through. We can bring back down debt overnight, but we can't change social implosion on a society in under a generation. Secondly, we need to be able to ensure that we deconstruct all the risks that small states face in borrowing, private sector investment and borrowing, and the premium that are attached for investment. We need to lower and level the cost of debt between the global north and the global south, particularly as it relates to climate crisis matters. We need to also ensure that there's access to the technology and to the plant and equipment. We come here and we say, let's do this, we're going to do this, and then you turn around, you can't get access to the batteries. You can't get access to the electric vehicles. Our orders are too small to command the market's attention. And therefore, you end up in a situation where you're playing catch-up all the time, while at the same time becoming less and less competitive as a nation for broader investment because of the high risk that you face being on the front line. So if we're not careful, we can reach a tipping point of being uninsurable and uninvestable. And when that happens, then you start to get climate migration. And all of us want to be able to work our way away from that precipice, because we already know what is happening in the world with migrants normally, and it is not in anyone's interest for that situation to continue for us. So I'll stop at this point and listen to others and come back in.
No, excellent. Thank you. I mean, the stakes are really clear for Barbados. And as you said, it's not just about Barbados. Actually, the risks are broad. You raised a lot of issues. Many of them I know that you think about as well, James. But I wonder if you could maybe start, because you do head the private sector arm of the IDB group, on the issues of, blue bonds and green bonds and sustainability linked bonds. I've heard so much about them already here at COP. So how much are you doing with that? What is already happening? What's the potential? Are there challenges with issuances? How much of a solution could that be for some of the challenges that the Prime Minister just mentioned?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real honor to be with such a distinguished panel and two of my shareholders. So we in the IDB group, and in particular IDB Invest, are obsessed with connecting development assets to impact investors. We've done it by developing capital markets instruments. We are now approaching 60 capital markets transactions across Latin America and the Caribbean. Reality is some of those at the beginning were in the larger economies. And when you refer to the first time you met a Prime Minister, I'll refer to when I met her in Washington, D.C. for the first time. She did mention the need to come together to harness the liquidity that you have in the Caribbean, the diaspora, and the connectivities that you have putting all together. So we developed this capital markets instruments for the Caribbean. We've launched a number of deals. I can refer to them in principles. But the only way we find that we'll ever have a dent in SDGs is when we link domestic and local capital markets, not the banking sector, domestic and local capital markets to institutional, to development assets. What small islands countries mean for us, and for us it's mainly the Caribbean, they've got the needs. They've got the oceans. They've got the solutions. What we have to do is finding ways to in this case, because many of those economies are relatively small, bring all those together to get the sizes of the deals that international investors want. So that's one. There's a lot of regulatory work to bring all these things together. And us play a role of certification of this, be it blue bond, be it green bonds. Recently, color of my hair, we issued silver bonds. So there's a lot of work to be done there, but also a role that we can play by de-risking those instruments. Many of international investors are looking for investment-grade assets. Many of the countries that we operate in the Caribbean, but across Latin America, are sub-investment grade. So there's a lot of work that we can do in the construction period and after that. So I'll stop here, but what I'm trying to say is that everything we're doing is going back to this concept of connecting one with the other.
And through a regional approach and aggregation, you can actually be able to tap into these pools of capital even for smaller economies. So that's good to hear. Okay. So I'd like to turn to Hong now. And Hong, as I said, is with the Green Climate Fund, a major source of concessional financing and other sources of financing for climate. You have specific targets linked to small island development states alongside least developed countries and African nations. What does that mean in practice? Do you hit those targets? And what are some of the reforms that are underway to serve these most vulnerable countries better?
Sure. Thank you. And I'll have to reiterate what James was saying. It's such an honor to be on stage with three of my stakeholders. So the Green Climate Fund, about 50% of our resources are meant to go to SIDS, LDCs, and Africa. And so for us, we've actually hit 66% at that point, at this stage. So 2/3 of our portfolio really go to the most vulnerable. But I think maybe I just have to start with the baseline, and this is something that we've been hearing all across COP, which is that there's just not enough money there. And so one of the things that we have been doing, and this was announced yesterday, is really to be transformative. How do we think about getting money much more efficiently, much faster on the ground? And so that's still not enough. We actually need money. There's so Barbados, for example, it's 0.01% of emissions comes from Barbados, like teeny tiny. And yet I have to congratulate Barbados for the announcement of becoming 100% renewable by 2030. I mean, this is just phenomenal.
Bravo. Yeah, that merits applause.
And so how can we be supportive of this? And I think that that's really where, this phrase of, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, thinking that you would have a different result. And so for us, it's really about time for us to think about the lessons that we've learned being such a young fund, and how do we transform what we do, and how do we get there faster. And so I'll talk a little bit about the Blue Green Bank that we've just invested in a minute, but that's a really good example of how can we think more systemically, how can we leverage what we do in terms of that risk transference to bring in more investments into these economies.
Actually, Hong, why don't you tell us a bit more about that right now?
Yeah. So this is, I love this project. So we, and Barbados is really fast in getting these projects off the ground. I think I was involved in the conversation less than a year ago, where there was a bit of ideation, and I would say 7 months later, it's actually come to fruition. So this is, we've invested in the Blue Green Bank for Barbados, but it covers 12 Caribbean countries, and it's a $15 million investment for equity investment, where we've taken first loss with Pegasus Capital Advisors, and that's with a fundraising of $30 million. Now this is the key for equity and the key for private sector. They wouldn't be able to do this without our first loss money, but it is meant to trigger within 15 years, $50 billion in lending. So this is enormous for Barbados and for the Caribbean countries. And when you think about and I think Mia, you mentioned that for Barbados alone, there needs to be at least $10 billion in investments. And so while this is a drop in the bucket, I think this is demonstrative of if you have an aggressive plan to really get there, we can scale it up. What you need to do is have an appetite to take that risk. And it's just incredible, and I think that this is replicable for other countries who don't think that they can get there in such a short period. But to think about 100% renewable by 2030, you have to take risks, and you have to invest in those risks.
If I can just add, the Blue Green Bank, USAID came in with us, Barbados has gone in, and we believe that we should also seek to expand it to the rest of the Eastern and Southern Caribbean once we get it operational. But we wanted to get it operational because what we're also doing is leveraging our RST money from the IMF in order to be able to make the combination of the two reach much further than either one could reach on its own. I also want to thank the IDB and Nature Conservancy, because we were able to issue our first blue bonds last year, and the savings and the interest from that will be between 50 to 60 million US dollars in the next 15 years, and that will finance the Barbados Marine Conservation Trust, which will allow us to be able to do the work in our maritime area that we badly need to do, given all that we've faced with loss of coral reefs, given what we've faced with the loss of fish stock, and given the potential for saltwater incursion into some of our wells. We're now about to do the debt for climate swap with IDB, with GCF, and with the European Investment Bank. And the savings from that should allow us to be able to move our sewage treatment plant on the South Coast from simply separating solids and liquids to a proper tertiary treatment plant that will allow us to replenish our aquifers as well as to water our root crops and our vegetables in a water-scarce country. So these things are unlocking. That will probably unlock about 125 million US dollars in savings over a 15-year period. So that these instruments are all part and parcel of the same arsenal of tools. It's just that some of them have applicability in terms of building adaptation. Some of them will have applicability post-disaster, like the debt pause clauses. But what we generally need more of is a recognition, and I thank all for beginning to understand it, because we've seen the needle change move when the RST moved from debt to GDP per capita as a trigger to climate vulnerability as a trigger. It was a major step, but what it should also do is to send the signal to others that we have to be more strategic and laser-like in determining what each dollar of debt can do and who should benefit. Middle-income countries have problems of vulnerability, and this is not to deny the worthiness of either countries. This is not to take away from the absolute need to recapitalize either, and in fact, we will resist the graduation of many countries from IDA as is being contemplated, I think. But what it does say, however, is that we equally don't want the pauperization of countries, because those countries that have come out of poverty do not want to return back to poverty purely because they're vulnerable. And therefore, if we can begin to understand that you can't choose between people and planet, you can't choose between education and health and climate adjustment, because I might save myself from the worst effects of climate, but die from riots or crime, or die from pandemics. And therefore, we are human beings that have complex biological systems. One organ can't work without the other. And similarly, globally, we cannot pursue one element of policy while leaving the rest of it on the table. And hence, the discussion for global public goods is really where we need to be running fast to get there. Because when I come and say, okay, well, let's have some money now for pandemics, people will say, but I thought you wanted for this or you wanted for that. The truth is, we need to have the total perspective, but accept that the one that is the most urgent is the climate crisis.
Very well said. A lot said there, and I'm going to come back to you for closing words in a moment. But I'd like to go to James with something that you just mentioned now, but also in your opening. You talked about the climate resilient debt clauses as one of the most important things that you had seen movement on. Now, IDB was the first mover in having these so-called, at the time, hurricane clauses. And so I guess I want to hear, James, from your perspective, how has the instrument worked? How has demand been? Any lessons learned? Is there going to be a version 2.0?
Yeah, thank you. So we started maybe 4 or 5 years ago using this clause. We used to call it El Niño clause because it was primarily in the Andean region for the agricultural sector. Then we started opening up this to other sectors, and not surprisingly, we call it internally the MIA clause. You can imagine why. And we started moving it into physical infrastructure. The deal that we have with the Port Authority in Barbados has this clause. We think it's primarily extremely important to do it because beyond the humanitarian aspects that I think are important, it's a savvy business decision. The worst thing that you can do is request heavy payments in the middle of a catastrophe that is affecting the P&L of a company, because you'll accelerate that company, you'll take it to bankruptcy. The best thing that you can do, I'm leaving my development hat, I'm leaving only my banker hat, it's a good decision to take. So up to now we've used it in our clauses. In all honesty, the capital markets has not got used to it. I know that your international bonds do have it. Some of the investors are still not really used to it, so we'll have to. So for example, I didn't mention it to you, Prime Minister, but what I said in the debt clauses that we're having is that if the investors are willing to take that liquidity risk for a couple of years, I can be a liquidity provider during those 2 years and increase my participation in those bonds. So, I mean, there's solutions that we can find to this, but it's been an amazing instrument because it's an enormous selling point. If you go to the client and tell them this is available, he's more interested. They are more interested.
And actually, it makes sense that you want the entire ecosystem to adopt the clauses, right? So you want bilaterals, you want everybody, the private sector as well as well. That makes sense. All right, so I think we're nearing our final few minutes. I'm going to start with Hong, James, and then the last one will be for the Prime Minister. I'm an optimist. Anyone who knows me knows that. And so, but the challenges are real and sobering. But Hong, from your perspective, if there's one big bet you have on something that the GCF can do, can improve on to, with greater speed, effectiveness, and ease, serve small island development states, what would it be?
God, so this is an unplanned question. So I think for us, it really is to try and figure out the speed for smaller projects. Right now, we're closing at about 12 to 17 months for our projects, which is amazing if you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project. But when you're talking about, a $15 million investment, it should happen a lot faster. And so that's the thing that we're targeting, and this is something that we want to target in the short term. So we should be seeing a lot more money flowing there. And then I would say that the other component is capacity building. We really need to speed that up a lot more.
Fantastic. Thank you, Hong. And some of you may know, there's been a lot of talk about how to work with all the big four climate funds, including, of course, the GCF, to not only make each of them work better with more ease and speed, but also how the four can be more complementary to each other. And so there's a review that the G20 incoming presidency, the Brazilians, I think are going to lead this year, and we look forward to that. James, same question in terms of ambition for small island development states and how best you can serve them, especially as you are now defining an entirely new business model and vision for IDB Invest.
So we started this journey about 7 years ago, and at the request of the Caribbean shareholders, there was a target including of doing 10% of our business in the 9 Caribbean countries that we operate in. At that time, IDB, previous to IDB Invest change of name, we were doing $50 million. This year, we're going to close $1 billion in those 9 countries. Wow, I never expected a clap. I put somebody in the audience to clap. No, but what we learned through that journey of hiring more people on the ground, being more closer, is that today there are tools that we don't have. Project preparation tools. We don't have equity. There's some of the markets that are very low rated sovereign countries, and that limits our activity. So you're going to have in front of both of your desks in a few months a capital increase of IDB Invest in the context of taking more risks to access more development. So more to come over here, and hopefully that gets to a good place. But all of these ideas of changing our business model have been learned from the experience of operating 7-8 years in these 9 countries.
Excellent. Thank you. We look forward to the papers, and we'll compare notes with the minister, so your shareholders will give you joint feedback. Prime Minister, when you set a challenge, many try to deliver. You have the BIA clause. What challenge do you have for us in this now new iteration?
I think that, and before I do that, let me thank James for the excellent work that IDB Invest is doing in the region, and simply say to you that yesterday Ilan and Jean Leon agreed that we should approach IDB, CDB, World Bank, EIB, and CAF, perhaps need to work collectively, strategically. But secondly, that with the CARICOM Secretariat, what we need is a SWAT team that can do project preparation and that can allow the countries truly to benefit, because just as GCF has a long gestation period, we have a problem with lack of capacity in project preparation. What's the new changes? We need a framework for global public goods and global governance. And I think that the US is well positioned to help shape that conversation. We need also to look at the future of the insurance and the reinsurance industry. If we don't get this right, it will lead to the implosion of many small businesses and households, because they need insurance to engage the banking sector, and it's at the center of the global economy. We need also the recognition that long-term lending is going to be critical for countries to stay and keep their heads afloat. And why? Because to get the fiscal space that we need to deal with the overall package of development, including climate and the SDGs, we need to be able to have the elbow room fiscally. But at the end of the day, finance is not the destination. And to that extent, if we don't work quickly, we can't protect ourselves from what the future holds in terms of the increased temperatures. And therefore, we need to ensure that we can get that space almost immediately. If we can get that recognition that climate adaptation and SDG-related spending that is fundamentally social should be 30 and 40 year, that's going to go a long way. And then finally, debt sustainability metrics need to change. If you put all the money in front of me and I can't touch it because my trajectory for debt stability is too steep, then I can't meet the need of adapting to the climate, because you've crowded me out from the very beginning and I become a victim without even starting. So we can't be talking much more on debt to GDP at 60%. It doesn't work. Every European country is at 90, and we need to recognize that because of the polycrisis, we need to have that relaxation on that trajectory. Thank you.
I asked to be challenged. Challenged I was. Listen, for me, at the end of the day, whether or not the international financial architecture is fit for purpose will be tested in the most vulnerable, smallest economies. So that's the bar that we here at the U.S.
And let me thank you. And I've got to thank where thanks are due. Let me thank you for your efforts and your commitment to replenish the GCF, because I know the difficulty with the domestic politics and the difference between Congress and the executive, and therefore we know it is not a simple act. And the fact that you've been able to come here and make that commitment of $3 billion says that you have not lost sight of what is truly important. So thank you.
Thank you for the thank you. Thank you for joining us, all of you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you.